Greetings, conservatives. This is ConservaCast episode 4. My name is John Moraga. If this is your first time aboard, welcome. If you've joined us before, thank you for coming back. As much as I would love to demonstrate my brilliance of philosophy, alas, there are only so many minutes in an hour, and only so many years in a millennium. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it today. Let's kick it off with marriage and the social contract. Now, I'm fully prepared to lose support or listeners because this is a very touchy subject, a very controversial issue. And right off the bat, most of you may already have some idea where I might be going with this and what I might be addressing, but you might be surprised of what I might want to talk about here. But let's get some of the air out of the way, or let's air some of this a little bit here. Obviously, there is some controversy with what some would consider same-sex marriage. And the reason why there is a bit of a controversy or a little bit of a disagreement in that is that I would comfortably say the vast majority, if not all conservatives, would understand the definition of marriage to be the traditional Judeo-Christian definition of marriage, which is a monogamous, heterosexual, contractual relationship. And that's in and of itself something that has a lot of factors. Well, I shouldn't say a lot of factors, but it has a number of factors that have a lot of variables, so to speak, as to how they might be applied. And the reason why the most controversial one most recently is same-sex marriage is because we, as a society, have essentially become desensitized to any other types of, shall we say, heterodox forms of marriage. What I mean specifically is we should consider what happened in 1969 when California became the first state to enact a form of, quote, no-fault divorce, or allowed for there to be anything other than adultery or extramarital affairs or extreme circumstances that would not otherwise permit there to be a divorce. The passage of that in 1969 essentially led to every other state passing some form of no-fault divorce up until 2010. Every state and the capital, Washington, D.C., now permit some form of no-fault divorce. Now, this is where I would assume, a lot of cringing, a lot of moving around in the seats, and because just statistically, odds are there is a good percentage of people who might be listening to this who either are themselves divorced or come from divorced families, their parents being divorced, or directly part of a step family. And there's a very diverse mixture of family dynamics in our society these days. Now, that is not to say that there is anything to not consider because of those dynamics. On the contrary, my point is that as a result, the benefactors of the no-fault divorce have then caused there to be other types of domino effects. What I mean is the most recently controversial same-sex marriage issue could be either directly or indirectly related to this. Because if you consider that there are a generation or two or three, depending on how you count, quote-unquote, generation, but there's at least 50 years, or nearly 50 years between the two major changes in legislation, i.e. in 1969, no-fault divorce in California, and in 2015, same-sex marriage passing the Supreme Court. There is a considerable time frame that the children of those no-fault divorce parents and step families, and if not they themselves, people who are their family or friends and interact with them, begin to see that there is more of a acceptance, or at the very least, the reduction in seeing it and perceiving it as a taboo. And so even as recent as, the 70s and 80s, a divorce may have seemed a little bit of a awkward thing to mention in discussion amongst mixed company. By the time you got to the turn of the century, it was no longer something that was embarrassing by any means. It was something that was pretty much just part of a conversation, as in my first marriage, or my stepbrother, or my dad's house, as opposed to my parents' house, or my house where both of my parents are. And this is something that obviously is going to hit you directly or somebody you know directly. And in my case, my parents were not divorced growing up, but my wife's parents were. And many of my friends and families growing up were divorced. So it's not as though it's unfamiliar to any of us very closely. My point is just that if we consider that, first of all, that would be one area of marriage that might be addressed before we consider anything of same-sex marriage. Now, that is not in any way to defend that type of lifestyle, but it is to say before we throw stones, perhaps we should consider some things that aren't as extreme in most of our views, but perhaps have now become more accepted and more normalized. Because the reason why I believe this is important is because, as I said initially, the part of the result, or part of what may be a result, is the passage of same-sex marriage. But also, how about just the understanding of that commitment, that contract, that agreed upon endeavor? Now, you may notice oftentimes I may dip into the Bible or into a biblical narrative, and I can almost guarantee it is not necessarily to proselytize or to evangelize by any means. Indirectly, if that is what one perceives, that is not necessarily my intent, but there is so much, I believe, richness in Scripture that even if you don't apply a theological analysis of it, the narratives are beautiful. They're engaging. They're deep. There's so much there to draw from that a theological interpretation aside, there's a lot to be appreciated. So when I bring that up to say that we understand the institution of marriage based on the biblical precedent of it and the Judeo-Christian understanding of a heterosexual, monogamous, contractual relationship. And when we consider that portion of it contractual, that has a lot of connotation to it. And so I want to spend just a minute or two. I know sometimes I can ramble on and things might run a little long, and so some of you may appreciate that, some of you may not. But if you'll allow me to open this up just a little bit, if we see that the contract aspect of it implies that there is an interaction between at least two parties. It's common sense. It's pretty straightforward. You obviously can't have a contract with yourself, correct? I mean, you might, but it'd be a little odd. It'd be a little neurotic. I'm not exactly sure how you'd enforce a violation of that contract if it was just with yourself. But nevertheless, I digress. So understanding that just inherently, by definition, a contract is inferring the relationship between two parties, a confirmed, set upon, either written or verbal set of ideas or statements. The main point that I'm making is that there are two parties required to engage in this contract. Now, Those two parties are where I'm going with the social contract, but also within marriage itself, and drawing it back even deeper to a conservative approach to it. Now, if we understand traditionally as conservatives, if I could just take a little bit of a moment here, we emphasize the individual. We emphasize individual rights. We emphasize made by our Creator. We emphasize the idea that we have the autonomy to pursue our happiness, our life. That emphasis on the individual is pretty sacred to conservatives. But once we leave our individual self, once we look outside of ourselves, no man is an island as we understand it. Once we understand that we have to engage with other human beings, we can't be hermits, we can't be secluded. Once we understand that we have to engage with our friend, our sibling, our parent, our spouse, that inherently over time has required some type of set rules, whether they just be understood within cultural norms or whether they be actual written laws. The idea that there is a social interaction, we are a social creature, that there are norms and accepted morals that groups of people accept and use to function as a society. However primitive or advanced, that is pretty fundamental to them. So when we understand that, we understand that the Judeo-Christian approach to that interaction has given humanity the concept of these contractual engagements. The idea that God engages in covenants with humanity, the idea that humans engage in these covenants and contracts with one another is pretty prevalent throughout the Bible. And so the idea that if we take our cues, if we understand that we, in order to replicate these ways of interacting, i.e., the use of contracts and covenants and agreements, verbal, written, whatever it may be, then we understand that when it comes to marriage, when it comes to this specific type of interaction amongst two or more parties, in this case, it's defined by two parties, two individuals who happen to be heterosexual. But beyond that, beyond defining these parties, it also defines certain types of commitments and obligations. And without, again, getting too far into the practical and symbolic applications of marriage theologically, my underlying point is just to reinforce the idea that marriage in and of itself is an act of entering into a form of an agreement, a contract. Now, ironically, that is pretty much what a lot of pro, quote, same-sex, end quote, marriage proponents use, is the fact that marriage is simply a contractual agreement, is simply something that is legally binding between two independent parties. Now, I don't want to dissect that too far. I'll leave that perhaps for another episode. I'm just merely addressing the fact that we should understand, in this particular case, marriage being contractual, an agreement that two parties are entering. And if we understand that, then we also should appreciate the seriousness of that contract, the severity of violating that contract, the consequences of breaking that. You know, it's really interesting that there are hundreds or probably thousands, or I'm not sure the number, but many lawsuits based on lawsuits of violations and breaches of agreements and contracts. Most industries, when you reach a certain level and there are certain numbers of funds involved, oftentimes have to deal with certain lawsuits based on breaches of contract or disagreements and what may have happened because of that. And there is a lot of money exchanged in the course of those lawsuits. The reason is because people take these contracts and agreements seriously. There is a consequence to breaching these contracts. Now, anybody who's been divorced can tell you, oh, yes, there are definitely consequences to breaching these contracts in that sense. But I want to address something on a more on a broader scale, in the sense that what are the other consequences that we may not consider have resulted? I already mentioned the progression towards same-sex marriage and the idea that there is a breach of contract. But as a result, you get a cynical understanding. You get a desensitized approach to what this type of contract means. And when it is so close to your personal upbringing, your nuclear family, when you experience your parents divorced or have this breakdown at a young age, as millions of children have had in the last few decades, well, then you may not be so prone to take other types of contracts or commitments seriously. And there is an open, I shouldn't say open, but there are many examples to which you could point to that if you trace that psychoanalysis back far enough, you could see where there may be a lot of contribution from divorce and broken homes and step families that may have contributed to these types of decisions from these children who are products of these divorces. I guess what I'm trying to say without getting too complicated is essentially you have children and generations of people who have experienced divorce and broken homes, who at a young age do not take marriage seriously, but not only do they not take marriage seriously, they don't take serious contracts or commitments seriously. They don't take people's words seriously. People's integrity becomes questioned. People's trust is very scarce. And so the idea that after a generation, 2 generations, essentially going on 3 or 4 generations of people who have developed these quote unquote trust issues or integrity, paranoia, if you will, to some degree, that, basically there's just been a very desensitized, raw approach to a lot of other things that I believe stem from these initial experiences and exposures to broken homes, divorces, and step families, etc., that arguably are far more damaging and have caused far more detriment to our society than any type of same-sex or homosexual marriage, at least thus far, because, as I mentioned, it may have actually contributed directly or indirectly to that anyway. I'll take it a few steps further if you'll allow me to go a little further down the rabbit hole. How about just the generation of dysfunctional millennials? If you're 35 or older, you're able to look at those who are 34 or younger who may fit in that millennial category, and the lines get blurred. But the point is, it's a very drastic turnoff and cutoff that is pretty apparent, at least in my opinion, from premillennial to postmillennial, so to speak, generation. And the reason is that the younger the generation, the more likely they are to be exposed to broken homes, divorced parents, step families, etc. And so when there's a higher percentage and a larger perpetuation of these types of family dynamics, then you get more, and there is more of this type of dysfunction produced. And so for those of us who may be a little bit older and we look at some of the younger people in our society, we may be questioning, how did we get here and why are they doing this? We should maybe consider they're doing this and they're acting this way because we and the generation before us set things in motion for them to do that. The term latchkey kids used to be more of a rarity than the norm. The idea that a parent was not around as often, or both parents weren't around as often for children, was not as common. It would still happen. It's still always been around in our society. I don't want to be naive to what has always existed. But it has not risen to the level that it is now, to the level of acceptance, to the fact that, again, in 1969, no-fault divorce had passed. In 2015, same-sex marriages cleared SCOTUS. So there's more than just the hyperbole to say, oh, yes, we're going in one direction, when there's obviously legislation to demonstrate that progression and how we understand marriage. So all this to kind of bring it back around to understanding what a commitment is, what a contract is between two parties, between two entities, to say we are agreeing upon these set of ideas, these set of standards. And when it becomes accepted, or becomes more accepted at least, rather than it used to be, to breach those contracts or agreements, then it should be no surprise when there are other types of agreements that are violated or breached among those in society. Whether they're business agreements or political treaties or agreements, whatever the case is, it's no surprise that generations will increasingly become cynical and mock the idea of these types of these forms of integrity, these ideas of agreeing upon certain things and sustaining those agreements. That leads to the social contract. And as I said on the offset of this episode, as much as I would love to demonstrate my brilliance of philosophy, alas, there are only so many minutes in an hour and only so many years in a millennia. I don't want to delve that far into the history of philosophy and philosophers. So, just briefly mentioning Jacques Rousseau, not Jacques Rousseau, but Rousseau, a 18th century philosopher, basically credited with popularizing, if not for the most part, single-handedly making the term social contract known amongst his peers and for generations to come. The idea that we enter into this agreement amongst our peers, our neighbor, those in our society, it predates Jacques Rousseau's work, but because he popularized it, his main point, essentially, again, I don't want to simplify it this much, but just for the sake of drawing the connection to what I had just spoken on. Essentially, when we are born, and in order to sustain our own existence, essentially, in order to preserve our own individuality, our own independence, we, in essence, have to not submit or sacrifice some of that, but we understand that in order to do that, we need to give of ourselves to our fellow man in some type of agreement and some type of mutual protection. And the reason for that is understanding that in very again, basic or simple terms of natural law, the idea of self-preservation, the idea that we don't want to be murdered. If somebody murders us, is there no recourse for that? Is there no consequence for that murderer? Well, even if we get murdered, if that murderer is still loose in society, well then, does that murderer keep murdering, or do other people in society prevent that murderer from continuing to murder other people, because eventually they may murder the other people in society? I think most people would see where I'm kind of going with this. It kind of becomes self-explanatory that we don't want to lose our own lives, and so we will protect other people's lives in these cases in a way to save our own lives, to protect our own lives. If we can stop that murderer before he murders somebody else, well then we may potentially saved ourselves, because we could have been that somebody else. And so collectively as a people, we understand we may have to agree to go out and capture this murderer and either execute him ourselves in the act of actually trying to capture him, or arrest him, put him in jail. Whatever the case, there has to be some type of recourse. It's pretty straightforward and pretty common sense. And so if we understand that there is a certain level of sacrifice on our part in order to enter into this social contract, because just by the nature of contracts, there is some type of sacrifice, some type of compromise, some type of submission to the other party. That is the basis of that contract. I will give you some of this for, in return, you to give some of this, and we will agree this is how we will exchange this. Intentionally ambiguous, because you can fill in the blanks with your own words. The point is just we agree upon essentially giving of a portion of what we have so that we get a portion of what you have. The idea of a communal understanding, a mutual agreement, is essentially what the social contract concept was supposed to be. Obviously, it's far deeper than that. There's books and commentaries to delve deeper into that and studies into that. Just the point to relate back to the foundations of marriage. If we understand that if we don't take the concept of this contract, these types of agreements that may just be necessary to sustain our own interest, our own self-preservation, then our own self-preservation becomes compromised. And so, arguably, that's what I'm saying, is that leads to a generation, or generations, plural, of dysfunctional families and strenuous dynamics within a family. So it doesn't surprise me, or it shouldn't surprise anybody, that there is an acting out of this. And so you could say this is why you have online cyberbullying. If there's no repercussions for an anonymous child to vent their anger, either because they've never been disciplined, they don't have a form of that through both parents, or just the idea of having some type of outlet. I mean, there's a number of reasons, but as time progresses and as technology becomes more available, rather than this child going on and bullying another child, why is there not a parent taking that child out to do an activity, to study with the child, to do something with that child, other than allowing that child to engage in that kind of activity? Now, there's a lot of finger pointing, there's a lot of blame to go around. I get it. But practically speaking, if we just examine what goes on in our own homes, in our own families' homes, in our own backyards, if we are honest with what happens right in front of us and what we have experienced and understand to be societally accepted and normal, I think we might be a little bit more surprised as to what we allow ourselves and others to get away with. If we understand what lies at the root of some of this dysfunction in our society, if we're honest about where we've come to based on these types of changes, we might have a little bit of a better understanding as to how to move forward with things. This is not to draw guilt to those who are divorced, who come from divorced families, by any means. Again, as I said at the offset of this, this hits home to most of us, or at least to most of the people we know close to us. It hits very personally. But when we see a number of things that we might see more prevalent and more common in the news, or just questioning why certain things may be happening in a scale that we may not be so familiar with, or history has very rare moments such as these, it's not too far of a stretch to point towards this. And I don't want to get, as I said, too far into theology. So I'm just saying, on a practical level, on a functional level, on a conceptual level, on a societal acceptance level, there's something to be said about the breakdown of how we see our immediate existence and interpret the larger existence of society. A child born in 1970, children born in 1970 who see families, their own immediate families, as dysfunctional as they are, then interpret in the 90s, 2000s in Congress how this type of dysfunction plays out, how this type of interaction with those close to them act. Again, I mean, I could spend so much time just drawing the correlations between where that breakdown happens and how it affects generations after, and how we might be better able to address what might be going on around us at the very moment. It's a heavy topic, so I'm going to move on to the next one, but it is something that I think has to be addressed in our own minds and our own hearts. So for another time, perhaps, I might pick that back up. But moving on to Mormons. Mormons should be drawing conservatives to jealousy. Now, another quasi-controversial issue here, and it may actually draw some praise, and it more than likely may draw a lot of criticism. I will say right off the bat, I probably have very little in common theologically with Mormons. Does that mean I don't care to speak to them? No, absolutely not. I would never dream of that. Does that mean I don't think they should anything? I mean, that doesn't mean anything other than I have any more in common with them than I might have a Muslim or any other type of term or religion. That being said, I'm making that point because I don't want it to be assumed that what I'm about to say is any affirmation of their beliefs or of their system of beliefs. Because I'm about to be very positive towards Mormons, but I want to qualify that I don't want to be positive necessarily towards any religious idea or beliefs because I don't agree. That being said, I hope and I will trust that you can make that distinction, that those who are listening are able to compartmentalize the difference between saying something positive about one's beliefs in religion and saying something positive about a group of people who might act a certain way or conduct themselves a certain way, irrespective of that religion. I really hope that makes sense. Anyway, what I mean by Mormons should be drawing conservatives' jealousy is that I think there are a lot of conservatives who don't understand how to have personal convictions and enter the lion's den and stand by those convictions and have an intellectual conversation. I think there are a lot of conservatives who are well-intended. I think they have a lot of passion. They have a lot of zeal that is oftentimes mixed with frustration and anger and despair. Understandably so. Understandably, there are those who have conservative ideas and values and traditions, who feel very ignored, very alienated in our society, in our country these days. But unfortunately, I think they move that zeal and passion to ignoring and blocking off certain types of communications and development. The downside to that is that you basically create echo chambers of conservative thought and ideas. Instead of trying to take those ideas outside of that echo chamber, outside of that common room, and allow them to be vented and challenged and taken into the lion's den. And why I was pointing out Mormons specifically is, as much as I disagree theologically with them, there is a very impressive, respected zeal and passion that they have that even I can acknowledge, even I can appreciate. Because even though they know that they may be shouted down, they may be asked to leave, they may be asked to, do a lot worse than that. But that's my point, is that even though they understand that they are going to be ridiculed or possibly, and there are times, obviously, there's converts, that they have a positive response. But any Mormon elder or any Mormon person who has gone out to try and convert people will probably tell you they have a lot of ridicule against them. And that's my point, is that even knowing the odds of being welcomed into this conversation And even at the times that they may be welcomed, they may be confronting people who are going to disagree with them and challenge them. Even though they're in those conversations, they stick by what they believe. They stick by their convictions. And again, this is coming from somebody who doesn't agree with their beliefs and convictions. I'm just trying to point out that if conservatives had a fraction of that kind of fortitude and passion and zeal to be able to engage others who aren't conservatives, or who may be quasi-conservative or sort of conservative, or who may be actually far liberal. But the fact that increasingly conservatives are resorting to these echo chambers and just basically shouting down and silencing those in their own circles who may not be as quote-unquote conservative as they define it to be, I think is a detriment to conservatism. It doesn't help us to convince others of our ideas. It doesn't help promote any of our values any more than they would if we never actually tried to talk to anybody at all about them. So there's, I think, a little bit to be drawn from this kind of approach that, albeit, as I said, and I can't say enough, I don't agree theologically, the strategy, the approach, the psychology, the understanding that even if I'm going to be challenged, I'm going to be firm in what I am saying and what I believe. Maybe they may mull it over later. Maybe they may reconsider it later. But the idea that there is a passion and a zeal that even I, who disagree almost probably 110% in some aspects with them, again, just tactically, strategically, we should, as conservatives, recognize how smart that is, how valuable that is. There's a lot of utility to being a listener without being influenced or compromising your own beliefs and ideas. Now, here is the better part of that. If you are able to be convinced or be the convincer, how much more value is there in that? And that goes within that theological frame of it. If you're able to draw somebody to your point of view and demonstrate the value of that point of view, when they're more than willing to listen but probably not be moved or convinced, then you're able to be even more effective with that. Because you've essentially convinced somebody who was the least likely to be convinced, correct? At least that's the way I view it. At least that's my 2 cents and why I've basically tried to draw some positive light towards that. Even, I'll say one last time, if I disagree theologically, strategically, tactically, there is something to be appreciated and recognized. So, finally, don't buy that there are 3 kinds of conservative spiel. The fallacy of the 3-leg stool, I should say stooge model of conservatism. Again, this is probably going to get me into some trouble, probably not as much as the prior 2, but hey, while I'm at it, I might as well just cover this issue. Now, if you are somebody who has listened to Rush Limbaugh or basically talk radio or conservative radio for the past few decades, you're pretty familiar with what is termed the three-leg stool model of conservatism, or phrased and termed in many other ways. But basically, it refers to the national security, fiscal, and social conservative types, so to speak. And I obviously I'm saying this a bit tongue-in-cheek because I personally don't really subscribe to this kind of approach or terminology or compartmentalization of it. Because basically what it is saying is that there are conservatives who give attention and who find certain aspects of things more important than others. So, for example, those who find social issues more important would probably give more time and attention and focus and judge a certain candidate or political party based on certain social issues such as gay marriage or abortion or euthanasia or other types of social issues that aren't necessarily related to the military and or fiscal issues, which are the other tier. So somebody who would be more interested in fiscal conservatism would be more interested in perhaps reducing taxes or reducing spending or finding a way to balance the budget or things that have to do specifically with the economy. And the other tier would be the national security conservative, i.e. somebody who is most concerned with our protection, those who have a strong military background or those who promote the military as a primary function of our government, who see it as pretty much the only reason to have a government is to protect us and to secure us from our enemies. So when you consider there is some truth to these, but my problem is just separating them as such. I'm not the first to have a problem with this, obviously, but it bothers me that this is still a term that is perpetuated and addressed, or these terms are put out there, much like the quote-unquote middle class. You know, that in and of itself, I believe, is a Marxist term, right? When you have social classes that you're referring to, in and of itself is a socialist terminology, yet even conservatives refer to it. Even Republicans, conservatives, whatever branch or whatever, not branch, whatever persuasion of politics you are, we now just colloquially use the terms middle class, upper class, whatever the case is. In the same way that we have started to, unfortunately, use social conservatives or fiscal conservatives or national security conservatives. It's just now kind of taken on their own life. But unfortunately, I don't think that actually is a good way to view conservatism or the different types of conservatives. You know, there's some truth to where some of this focus is. But I think that's actually more because of how politicians and focus groups and people who put out certain types of ads and marketing things have made it. Not as though the people themselves, we ourselves, have said, oh yes, we're only so focused here, we're only so focused here. It's almost as though they don't want to put the work into the complexities of conservatives. So they're basically saying you either have to fit into one of these three categories, or even if you fit into all three of these categories, we're only going to address these three categories and assume that they then will cover everything else. And you can kind of pick and choose within those categories what you may want, but ultimately those are the only three categories that we're going to pay for advertising and marketing campaigns and lobbying, etc., etc. So again, maybe that's my cynical self coming out, but it's kind of demeaning and embarrassing and insulting to think, well, why should I only be limited to three areas of thinking, or classify myself as one or even all three, but only three types of a conservative as though that is the only way to think of conservatism. Or, I don't want to be a oversensitive person to this. On the contrary, I just think it's very silly to confine conservatism to these things. It's just, if you're a conservative, you understand by nature you're far more complicated in your thinking and approach to things than just simply three ways and three aspects and three stools of three legs of a stool. Now, that being said, that shouldn't have any reflection on what Conservatives Corner has deemed and understood to be the three pillars of conservatism. That is not the same thing, because the claim is not that there are only three types of conservatives or three types of conservatism or a grouping of people. It refers to the foundations of what we believe conservatism rests on across all conservatives, across any type of form of political philosophy that would claim to be conservative. That's not to say that it's an absolute litmus test by any means, but we've tried to put forth the best way to evaluate what would be considered conservative thought. And based on that, we hope you're able to draw a pretty educated, informed, discerning evaluation of what would be conservative based on these ideas, based on these pillars, based on these foundational ideas and concepts. They are, for those of you who are familiar, they are biblical precedent as one, natural law is two, and federalism is three. And so basically, if you can find the association of those three within a certain political idea or thought, then odds are there's a pretty good likelihood that it is conservative thought. It does draw from conservative ideas and philosophy and politics. Now, we go through great pains to not be pro or anti specific people or parties. Do we have our own personal opinions? Of course, we're human beings. We have our own personal ideas and views. But as a whole, Conservatives Corner doesn't make an official endorsement or chastise any person or party specifically. Because the whole objective and point is to try to progress in the real sense of the word progress, conservative ideas, promote them, champion them. Allow the next generation to understand the value of these conservative ideas and thoughts. So rather than confining conservatives to three categories or simply just three terms in how to look at conservatism, on the contrary, Conservatives Corner hopes to expand that to the complexities of conservatives across many facets, across many issues. Well, folks, that wraps up another episode of ConservaCast. Once again, my name is John Moraga. Thank you for joining us here at Conservatives Corner. If you've gotten something out of this, please consider subscribing at conservativescorner.com/order. There are a number of ways you can invest a contribution in helping us champion conservatism for generations to come at conservativescorner.com/order. conservativescorner.com/order.